If your plants are getting ample sun and you're consistently watering them, but still they look a little bit stunted or maybe they look a little bit yellow, you may be missing one very important component, and that's fertilizer. So today I want to dive into the nuts and bolts of fertilizer. I want to talk about the different types, what fertilizer is, what it does for our plants, how and when we can use it effectively in our garden, and times where we may want to avoid fertilizing. And if you stay till the very end, I'm going to share a way that you can make a easy, free fertilizer from what you already have growing in your garden. So let's dive into it. In the backyard garden setting, we are growing more in a space than the natural native soil can usually support. Because of this, we want to add a boost of nutrients to that soil. And we can do this in a few ways. You'll hear me talk about all the time how adding compost is important. And it is. You should absolutely add compost. But that may not be quite enough, especially for the first year or two that you're getting your garden up and going. And so we want to add some fertilizer right at the start just to give our plants the best start possible. What I like to do is start with an organic granular fertilizer. Now you can get granular fertilizers that are not organic. Those are a little bit cheaper. They're still going to be fine. They're not harmful to the soil if used correctly and if used in moderation. They're not harmful to the soil, but they're not made of organic natural materials. There's a chemical process that happens. So because of this, I like to stick with the organic options because I also know that it's good for my soil health over time. It will actually help me build that soil over time. So anytime before I plant, at the start of the season, I add a little bit of that organic granular fertilizer to the soil. I use something that is well balanced. I like Dr. Earth's. Typically that's what I use, but there are a lot of different options. When we talk about fertilizer, we're gonna look at what's called the NPK. And NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the main nutrients that your plants are gonna need. There are a lot of trace minerals and trace nutrients that are also beneficial for your plants that we shouldn't overlook. But just to keep things simple, we're gonna look for a well-balanced NPK. We don't want something too high. So something like a 20-20-20, that would be too high for our plants, generally speaking. A 5-5-5 is that sweet spot. That's about what we want. A lot of fertilizers don't have the 5-5-5. They might be a 3-3-2 or a 3-2-3. All of those are going to be fine. My personal recommendation is to try to stay around that 5-5-5 range or at least under 10-10-10. Okay, so we start with that organic granular fertilizer, and that's great. That's going to get our plants off to a good start. The thing about the granular fertilizer, though, is that it's not immediately available to your plants. It actually has to be broken down by the soil. So it kind of feeds the soil and then ultimately feeds your plants. And this process can take a while. So because of this, we also like to use a liquid fertilizer or a water-soluble fertilizer. There are a lot of different options when it comes to your water-soluble fertilizers, your fertilizers that are immediately available to your plants in a form that they can immediately take up. You will see a lot of options that are what we would call a synthesized fertilizer. That's not an organic fertilizer. And the thing about synthesized fertilizers is it's not necessarily that they're bad. It's that they go through a chemical process and they are immediately available to your plants. They will give a nice boost to your plants, but they do nothing to build soil over time. And there are some that maybe aren't as great for the soil health in the long run. If you overuse synthesized fertilizers, you can actually damage the soil life, the microbes, and things like that. And here again is an area where I like to go with the organic options. They are a little bit more pricey, but I know that those organic options are actually going to promote the soil health over time, whereas synthesized fertilizers can diminish the soil health. One in particular that I really like to use is AgroThrive. Now, there's a lot of different options you can use when it comes to your liquid fertilizers, but I prefer AgroThrive. I like that because I know that it's made with organic, natural ingredients. It lasts me for a really long time. I get a big bottle and you only need a little bit, so it lasts me for a very long time. I'll actually leave a link in the description below for you to check out in case you want to buy AgroThrive. But you don't have to. There's a lot of different other options that you can choose. Like I said, it's going to be about your preference and how much money you want to spend. So when it comes to the actual process of fertilizing our plants, we start with the organic granular at the beginning of the season. We build that into the soil, and it's going to be, like I said, available to the soil to break down over time. As our plants are growing, we can then shift our focus and attention to using a water soluble or a liquid fertilizer. This is something we're going to mix up in a watering can. For me, when I mix up the AgroThrive, it's 2 ounces of liquid AgroThrive for every gallon of water. It's best if we can use rainwater, but tap water will work in a pinch. That's all I have right now, so that's how I mixed mine up. But when using the liquid fertilizer, like I have AgroThrive here, you want to direct it at the base of your plants. It's important to make sure that your plants have been watered before you add the fertilizer, because you don't want it to burn the roots. Even though AgroThrive is pretty gentle, you still don't want it to burn the roots. And also, you just don't want your plants to be struggling for water. If you water after you add your fertilizer, it can actually wash that fertilizer through the soil and it just not be available to your plant. And you're not going to need a lot here. I usually count to 3, maybe sometimes 5 if my plants are bigger. When it comes to when to fertilize your plants, a lot of people prefer to stick with a consistent schedule. Other people may prefer to only use fertilizer if they think their plants need it or at specific times in the life of the plant. But just to keep things simple, I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of a schedule. So I start with giving my plants a little boost of fertilizer when they're seedlings and they have gotten their first set of true leaves. And I'll do this by bottom watering my plants with the fertilizer already added into the watering can. And it's really important though, when our plants are really young, when they're seedlings, that we reduce the amount of fertilizer that we give them. You can really cut it by a 1/4 strength or a 1/2 strength, depending on how high that NPK is for your brand new baby seedlings. From that point, I keep my plants on between a 2 and 4 week watering schedule. As they come into fruit production, what we do not want is a lot of nitrogen. So that N number, we don't want a lot of nitrogen because that's going to promote a lot of green growth, but it could stunt fruit production. So because of this, as our plants come into maturity and they begin to bear fruit, a lot of times will stick with that 2-week schedule, but you really could reduce down to 4 weeks at this point, depending on the type of fertilizer you're using. Because I'm using AgroThrive and there's not a whole lot of nitrogen in it, it's not super high in nitrogen, I don't really worry too much about reducing down to 4 weeks. But if you had something that was higher in nitrogen, you would want to. When it comes to your fruiting plants, especially tomatoes, when they come into fruit production, they're going to need a lot less nitrogen, but they do need a lot more phosphorus and potassium. If you've amended your soil well at the start, if you have compost, if you have granular fertilizer already added into that space, you're probably going to be just fine here. If you notice that maybe fruit production isn't what you expect it to be with your tomatoes or with any of your fruiting plants for that matter, there are specific fertilizers you can use that are a little bit higher in phosphorus. And if it says something like tomato fertilizer, it's probably higher in that phosphorus, and it's probably going to work really well for your tomatoes, but also most of your fruiting plants. I'm curious to know, what's your favorite fertilizer? What are you using in your garden this year? Leave it in the comments down below. So let's say maybe you're not fertilizing on a schedule, or maybe you are, but your plants have endured some damage. Let's say they've went through a cold snap that was unexpected and they look a little stunted afterwards, or there's been some pest damage or a bug infestation. After you deal with those things and after you get through those things, it's a really good idea and a really good practice to give your plants a little boost of fertilizer just to help them get back growing healthy and strong. Another important time to give your plants fertilizer is if you've done any heavy pruning or removed a lot of the leaves. Now, I just went through something like this. I had powdery mildew on my squash plants and I came out, I sprayed, I kind of got the powdery mildew under control, but afterward, I had taken off quite a bit of the leaves and my plants they needed a boost. So what I did was I gave them a boost of fertilizer. I was doing the every 2 week schedule and I gave them a boost of fertilizer in between just to get them back healthy and strong fairly quickly, and it does help quite a bit. There are some important things to keep in mind when it comes to fertilizing, specifically that you can overdo it. I talked about in the beginning finding a fertilizer that had a balanced NPK, keep your soil healthy, adding in that compost and all of those things. And that will go a long way, and also a consistent schedule. But that will all go a long way in helping you make sure that you're not overdoing it. But some symptoms and things to watch out for that tell you that maybe you are overloving your plants with fertilizer is you'll start to notice that even though you're giving them fertilizer, they begin to turn light green. It's really tempting almost to give them more fertilizer because they look like light green. Light green is usually a symptom of a nitrogen deficiency, but it can also be a symptom of over-fertilizing your plants. If you start to notice browning of the leaves, more than just like the dead leaves on the bottom or the dying leaves on the bottom of it, if you start to notice that your new growth is coming out yellow or there's some browning around it, this is a really good indication that you've probably overdone it on the fertilizer, and you should hold back on your fertilizing and start watering a little bit more. Something else that you might notice if you're overdoing it is you have a lot of green growth but no fruit production. I talked about this a second ago, but this is really good indication, especially with your fruiting plants, that they've got a lot of nitrogen, but they don't have what they need to produce fruit. So if we're adding too much fertilizer to our fruiting plants, what's going to happen is they're going to continue to grow. They're going to look really pretty. They're going to look really healthy, but they're not going to set fruit. In these cases, hold back on the fertilizer. It might be a good idea to just actually reduce your fertilizing schedule when they come into fruit production. You could do something like fertilizing every 2 weeks in the beginning of the growing season as your plants are getting established, and then pull back to once a month once they come into maturity and they come into that fruit production. And I'm curious to know, are you fertilizing on a schedule this year? Leave me a comment down below and tell me what your fertilizing schedule looks like. If you're even using fertilizer. A lot of people will say they don't need to use fertilizer if they are adding compost and they're taking really good care of their soil and they're taking good care of their plants. A lot of people will choose to skip fertilizer altogether, and this is a viable option. I would encourage you that this is probably a best practice once you have your soil established. If you're brand new to gardening and you've just started your beds, you might want to start with the fertilizing schedule and then next year see how your soil is and how your plants do next year if you kind of hold off on the fertilizer. But it is a really viable option just to keep your soil healthy. A lot of compost, a lot of organic matter, adding leaves to the soil, all of that is going to go a long way in adding enough nutrients to the soil to keep your plants healthy and strong. I've never had soil quite that healthy, to be honest with you, and it's something that I'm looking forward to doing over time. As I've started this new garden, this is my very first year growing in it, my goal is to really build this soil health, to get really nerdy about what my soil needs, adding amendments and things at the beginning of the season. And ultimately, my plan is to reduce on how much I have to rely on fertilizers. But again, when we talk about growing in the backyard garden, we talk about growing high intensity, high density, using the square foot gardening method. We're growing plants really close together. And we're growing plants a lot of times that are not native to our area. We're growing plants that aren't just going to naturally spring up and we're going to have, a whole bunch of tomato plants in a small amount of space. That's not naturally going to happen. And so because of that, because we want to be able to keep those plants healthy and not struggling and not competing for resources and nutrients, fertilizer goes a long way in helping our plants throughout the growing season. Okay, so when it comes to a free, easy fertilizer that you can make in your very own garden with what's already growing, that's gonna be a weed tea fertilizer. So this is gonna be really interesting, but whatever weeds you see in the native soil in your yard is gonna be there to fix the problems that you have in the soil. So if you have a calcium deficiency, you're gonna have weeds that can reach deep down into the soil and bring calcium up. It's really cool how this works. Nature itself is amazing at taking care of itself. Because of this, we can utilize what nature is already doing and get rid of the pesky weeds in our garden that's driving us crazy and turn them into food for our plants. The way that we do this is we are gonna get a 5-gallon bucket. Now, I don't have a 5-gallon bucket right now. I have a tote, so I'm gonna use that. You really can use anything. I'm using a tote here, so I'm not gonna fill it all the way up because it would be really heavy and really hard for me to pour out. But we're gonna get a tote or a 5-gallon bucket, something that has a lid. We're gonna then add weeds to that. Go around your yard and pull up all the weeds you can find. be mindful to not grab weeds that have already went to seed, or you may inadvertently spread weeds in your garden. But if they haven't gone to seed, you can go ahead and pull them up. You can pull up grass if you wanted to. Grass is really high in nitrogen and it breaks down pretty quickly to make that nitrogen available to your plants. So gather up as much weeds as you can find, put them in your little container, and then you're gonna fill it with water. And then you're gonna stick the lid on it for 1 to 2, maybe even 3 weeks. And I will warn you, when you go to open that lid in a couple of weeks, it's gonna smell awful. It's gonna be terrible. But that's necessary, and that's exactly what we want. So you're gonna keep it covered for a couple of weeks. You can come out every couple of days and stir it if you want to. And this will just kind of help things kind of break down and get those nutrients leaching into the water. After a couple of weeks, you're gonna be able to use this in your garden. You're gonna wanna strain off the weeds, the actual plant matter, and just get the liquid into your watering can. Now, you're gonna wanna dilute this because if you were to put it directly on your plants, it's gonna be too much nitrogen for them and it could burn your plants. So to do this effectively, what we wanna do is a ratio of about 1 part weed tea to 10 parts water. So it's super effective, it doesn't cost you anything, and it takes very little work and input from your part. I hope you got some value out of this video. And if you did, like and subscribe for more beginner-friendly gardening tips and for more conversations about things like fertilizing. This whole year, we're gonna be talking about that first-year gardener and how we can become better gardeners. So if you've been gardening for a while, consider leaving your insights in the comments below. We all deal with different gardening challenges. We all have different microclimates. We all have different environments that we're growing in. And what works in one garden may not work in another. But your insights are gonna be super valuable and super helpful. So please leave them in the comments down below and let's get some conversation going. If you're a first-year gardener and you have a ton of questions, again, leave those down in the comments down below because either somebody in the comments can answer them or we might be able to make a video that will help you in your gardening journey. We want to create community more than we want to do anything else. So thank you guys so much for watching today. I'm going to leave a video on your screen until the next one comes out. May your garden be filled with grace and may you be abundantly blessed. We'll see you next time. Bye.